Unless you plan on creating your meshes and baking textures all within the same program, it's very likely that you're going to have to, at some point, export your high and low res meshes to a file format that can be used by other programs. This is a good way to make sure that all of these programs are referencing the same mesh for bake results that are consistent. .obj files are just about as close as you can get to a universal file format for mesh data. It contains all of the data that we need for baking, including an index of the vertices, normal information, UV information, and vertex color. OBJ files can also be saved with .mtl files, material files, but that's not something I ever make use of in my own work, and usually I would either delete them or I'll change the export options so that they aren't even created. OBJ files are what we'll be using when moving models between programs, but it's not the final format that you would ever submit to a game. A lot of times you would be better off with something like FBX or another kind of proprietary file format, but since we're just making a game model for a portfolio piece, we won't worry about that. For textures, we'll be using Targa files or .tga files. I'll be using 32-bit uncompressed Targa files because it's lossless and it includes alpha channel data. Uncompressed files, although they do occupy more disk space, they're faster to work with because they're not compressed. The file size of the texture is not really something we need to concern ourselves with at this point. So don't think that you're making better game art or more optimized game art because you're using a JPEG file or something like that. You should never be using JPEG files because it's really lossy and it has no alpha channel. And picking a file format that has an alpha channel is really important because a lot of modern shaders make use of it in some way or another. Ideally, you want to be able to create the look you want with as few files as possible, and the alpha channel is a very convenient location to store more data that an advanced shader can use. There are other file formats, of course, that have alpha channels like TIFF, PNG, BMP, but we'll be using Targa here. I think it's more common in the game industry to use Targa. And also the nice thing about a Targa file is that because it is lossless, it means that if you save it out and you're using it to preview your model and somehow you lose your source file, your PSD file, then at least you have a file that you can fall back on. I mean, you won't have your layers or whatever, but at least it's a nice quality file to work with again. When it comes to the final export of textures, the most common file format is probably DDS because it has a lot of real-time game art functionality built in, such as mipmaps and optimized compression. But we won't be using it here because that's kind of like the final step before you submit your model to the game. And also DDS compression is pretty slow and makes it kind of laborious to iterate with. So we'll just stick with Targa files for now. This is a good time to talk about organizing files. I admit that I often procrastinate about organizing my files as well, but it'll save you a lot of time and effort the earlier you do it. And of course, it helps other artists in production figure out what you're doing as well. I know this is really boring stuff, so I won't talk about it for too long, but it's pretty frustrating when you have to go and help someone. You sit down at the computer and you find out that all of their files are on their desktop, of all places, and their files are all mixed in with all sorts of other unrelated files, and all the files are named ASDF or 12345, or they're appended with new 1, new 2, new 3. So Do yourself a favor, create a dedicated directory for each project, and try to keep your working files separate from your final files to avoid clutter. Come up with a logical naming convention for your files and try to organize things so you don't have to jump in and out of different directories all of the time. Naming conventions aren't that big of a deal when you're working by yourself, but if you're working with others, then you're going to want to be more organized than that, especially if you're producing a large number of assets. A rule of thumb used in a lot of projects is to be descriptive with your file names, but terse. So, also trying to keep things as short as possible, and organize it from broader to finer. For example, if you're setting up a big project, you could start with something like this, where you have the name of the project and then an art folder, assuming you have other kinds of files in this project, like programming or sound or whatever. And in art, in our case, it would be characters to separate from environment art or effects or animations. And then within that, you'd have, I don't know, maybe the race or the gender, and then drilling down to more descriptive terms, such as the name of the character. And then within that, you could have your textures or source files or whatever. I recommend using some kind of folder bookmarking program. I have, for my own work, I like to use Direct Folders. It's a free program where you can, that works within Windows Explorer, that can help you jump to different places really quickly and easily. And there are a ton of these kinds of programs out there, and a lot of them are free. So I definitely recommend taking some time and looking through some. The baking stage is really the best time to get your act together and make sure all of your files are going to work together nicely. There's a lot that can go wrong when you're baking maps, and there are a lot of files to deal with, so the last thing you want is to have any complications come about because of files that are misnamed or misplaced.